Hello, this is Tom Chambers recording a video for Pokersavvy. My plan with these videos is going to be to spend the first 10 or 15 minutes talking from a PowerPoint slide, set of PowerPoint slides, covering a few of the key concepts that I hope to emphasize in the video. This particular video is intended for beginners, and the concepts that I want to have us focus on are starting hand selection, position, and redraws and blockers, the importance of each of these things. Move on to the next slide. The main thing I want to say about starting hand selection is that you need to focus on what the main goal of Pot Limit Omaha is in terms of what hands end up winning at Showdown, the kind of hands that you're trying to make. Generally speaking, one pair, two pair, are even top two pair are not going to be very strong hands in this game, and so you are playing to flop sets, straights, flushes, and big draws, and so the hands that you're going to want to play pre-flop are going to be the hands that are very good at doing one or more of these things. And it's sort of got a simple breakdown. The very best hands that you want to play are going to be hands that can flop the nuts multiple ways. This would be a hand like Ace, Ace, Jack 10 double suited, King, King, Queen, Jack double suited. These hands can flop top set. They can also flop the nut flush or second nut flush. They can also flop nut straights. And when they flop draws, they flop very big draws, over pair plus a wrap, things like this. The second class hands are hands that can flop the nuts one way with non-nut backup. Talking about things like aces with a suit, but not much else in the side cards, or something like King, Queen, Jack 10, Rainbow, or 10, 9, 8, 7 double suited, where you can flop lots of straights and nut wraps and things like that, but your flush draws aren't to the nuts. And then a third category of hands, which are generally playable in any position, and certainly playable in late position, are hands like dry jacks or queens, which can flop top set, or sort of mediocre wraps, something like Jack 9, 8, 6, things like this, where you don't have much going for you other than the one really strong element of your hand, except either that, or in some cases you'll have a few different ways to flop something good, but there's no way to flop an absolute monster, to flop the nuts. A hand like 10, 9, 9, 8 double suited. So these are the kinds of categories of hands that are playable and relative strength. I'm going to move on and talk about, so this is going to be a continuation of talking about starting hands, because the out of position trouble hands kind of give you a good sense of what some of the problems can be with the decent to barely playable hands. The three things that you need to watch out for are having 3-card hands when you're often going to be running into 4-card hands. Having King, Queen, Jack 2 against somebody who has King, Queen, Jack 10, especially if your hand's rainbow and they have a flush draw. Something like that, you're very often going to be getting it in either bad, or even if you flop the nuts, they're going to have redraws against you. You're going to be getting it on the 40 side of the 60-40 a lot. With wrap hands like Jack 9, 8, 5, or 10, 9, 8, 4, things like that, which barely connect to each other and which don't have pure connectedness like Jack 10, 9, 7 does. Again, you're not going to be flopping as many straights, you're not going to be flopping as many wraps or as strong of wraps. And so, especially when you're out of position, you're going to have a really tough time playing these hands because you're going to flop marginally way too often. And dry pairs are our last category that I want to really focus on, because you may have the appearance, you may think that that there's not much difference between kings, queens, and jacks, and in particular when you have queens, jacks, and maybe down to tens, you have a hand that's playable because it can flop top set, because it can flop middle set, which is decently strong. But if you don't have anything else going with it and you're playing this hand out of position, you're simply not going to make enough money when you flop a set, and you're in fact going to lose money sometimes when you flop a set, and you don't have anything else going for the hand. And so all of these things combined it's generally a good idea to fold that hand out of position and usually not defend unless you're going to be in a four-way pot where you know that you're going to get paid well if you flop top set. And the last thing to think about with something like jacks and tens is even when you do flop top set, the board is a lot more connected, which means that it's more likely that you'll be running up against a big straight draw, big straight and flush draw. And so you're not going to have as good of equity when you get in. This bit about in position, I've skipped this next line. When you have borderline hands, I would say that it would be better to have something like king, king, 7 deuce or queen, queen, 7 deuce, where you know at least that you can hammer the flop. You can hit the nut set, or you can flop the nut flush or something like that, as opposed to a hand like jack 9, 8, 7 single suited, which even though it may be playable, maybe jack 9, 8, 6 or jack 9, 8, 5, I would say, is unplayable. You're only going to be flopping mediocre in multiple directions. Maybe you flop a flush draw, but it's not the nut flush draw. You flop a straight, but it's not the nut straight. You flop top 2, or you flop middle set with something like tens, but it's not the nuts. And it's not you flop top 2 with jack 9, you're generally facing some big draws, and you're often going to be an underdog, or usually going to be an underdog if money gets in. This third line here, in position, raise a wide range and selectively apply pressure post flop. This is fairly standard poker 101 aggressive, tight aggressive strategy. Focus on a couple of things. This idea of selectively applying pressure, especially in Omaha, where people are generally willing, even at the lowest levels, I think, to the 25, 50 cent level, which is where this video is going to be. People are willing to ship stacks in. Now, I wouldn't say light, but they generally have more often they have enough to go with, where just mindlessly double barreling every time that you don't have a hand that you want to stack off with is probably not a good idea. On the other hand, there are a lot of times when someone checks, you see bet, they call, they check to you, you definitely should be barreling there. Without getting into examples now, it's kind of probably too generic or too general of comments that I'm making right now. But I guess the point I want to make is that especially when you're double barreling, and even when you're c-betting, you need to think about exactly what the bet's trying to accomplish, and look for situations where either on the flop or the turn it makes more sense to take a free card. This especially applies in 3- and 4-way pots. I would say proper c-bet percentage is pretty close to 100% when you're heads up. But you will be seeing a lot of multi-way pots, and even things like deciding when to check behind with the nut flush draw is another way that you can take advantage of position. And it's something that people don't necessarily think about. This last point, I'm not going to get into too much, but the basic idea is that especially if you know exactly who the more aggressive players are at the table, and you know what the tendencies of a pre-flop raiser are, your decisions as to what hands to play and how to play them post-flop, you can often maximize the value you get out of flopping top set by realizing that if you check to this guy, he's going to bet right behind you, and then 2 people might call and you can check raise big, things like that. So those are the key aspects of position that I think are important to think about. And I think there'll be a handful of times during this video when some of this will come up, as well as some things about just the general starting hand stuff. The last point I want to make, as far as how to value hands in Omaha and what really matters in terms of where your profit comes from, it's really important. I call this category redraws and blockers, but there's something a little more general going on here, which is that when you look at what your equity is on the flop and on the turn in Omaha, a lot of what's really important in determining, Omaha's a game of lots of 60-40s, and a lot of what's really important in determining which side of a 60-40 you're on versus the range that you're facing is having these extra little bits of equity that add up in addition to the main part of your hand. So flopping a set and having a gut shot or a flush draw with it, flopping a straight and having a flush draw, and free rolling a guy who has the same straight, or having an overwrap. For an example of that is flops 9, 8, 7 and instead of having just Jack 10, you have Queen Jack 10, which means that you have a couple of extra outs against somebody holding Jack 10. You can counterfeit them and make a Queen high straight. So all of these things add a few points of equity. Other things that add a few points of equity are having backdoor draws. You raise with double suited aces and you flop 2 backdoor flush draws. That actually does make a decent amount of difference in your equity. Partly because you can make a backdoor flush, also because if somebody else has got some kind of a draw that includes that same backdoor flush, now they can't make it to beat your dry aces. So that combination is pretty important. Another thing that's sort of, I think people don't realize or is underrated is the value of having a pair if you have a straight or a wrap. Particularly if you have something like a 13-out wrap with a pair, you can often be dominating somebody who has the same wrap and no pair. Either you guys are going to chop when you both get there, or you're going to win with one pair. And you're actually in a sort of 75-25 situation, which a lot of people don't realize. And also, again, you have a blocker if you're up against the set, which is nice also. So like I've been saying so far, you have this double effect. If you're behind, the hands in an opponent's range that you're behind when you get it in, you pick up a few extra outs. Even something as simple as having a gut shot when you have middle set. If you run into top set, you have something like 15 or 20% equity, whereas otherwise you'd be drawing dead. And the times that you're ahead, you have blockers. If you have a set and someone has a huge wrap and a flush draw, it makes a big difference if you have a couple of blockers in a gut shot so that you chop on that one card. And then in addition, you have, say, even if you don't have a better flush draw than them, you have a flush draw, which takes away 2 of their outs. Altogether, the point of this, and sort of tying it back to the stuff we've said about starting hands, if you are playing more consistently than your opponents, or just in general, your pre-flop strategy is to play the hands that often flop back up, as opposed to hands that generally flop, like the dry nut straight, the rainbow straight hands, versus having the flush hands, the flush draw hands, having when you flop a set of jacks, having connected cards with it. Things like this will allow you to be more aggressive post-flop with more of your range. You're going to get more semi-bluffing opportunities. You're going to get more opportunities to sort of pick up extra outs in the turn and double barrel profitably as a result of that. Things like that are really important in being able to maintain an aggressive style. All right, so that's going to wrap up this PowerPoint portion of the video, and the next 30 minutes or so are going to be me 4-tabling 25-cent, 50-cent pot limit Omaha 6-handed on PokerStars. All right, here we go. This is 25-cent, 50-cent on PokerStars. Like I said, we 4 tables going in just a second. First couple of minutes, I don't think much happens. I recorded this already. And I'm just going to talk over it and pause it if there are points at which it makes sense to do so. Going to try to focus on on the things that we talked about in the PowerPoint, on pre-flop decisions and on how to use position. And in a couple of cases, I think I'll get into spots that are a little bit tricky out of position, and you'll see why it can be a problem to play certain hands out of position, or the kind of tough spots you can get in. All right, here's the first hand that I play. Decent aces, got a suit, got a wheel card and a Broadway card. Not too likely to make a straight, but I can flop better than dry aces can now and then. Easy flop to c-bet. Now this is a pretty bad card. Now the fact that he called, it's already a pretty bad flop for my range, especially after the jack comes off. There's a lot of hands that beat me. I don't think that people at this level are likely to fold better hands or take advantage of a chance to float and bluff. So we checked down, and it turns out he had queens. But basically, I was giving up on that pot after the flop bet was called and that particular turn card came off. It's just not a good card at all. It's a spot where if check 2 on the turn, I might be able to get away with double barreling, but being the one out of position, I don't think it's a good idea to double barrel. All right, there's an example of pocket tens, but not much else. It was king 10, 10 deuce. Everything was a suit in there. You're just not going to get enough value out of flopping a set of tens, and you're going to get into too many bad spots. I think you generally should expect to be called in a couple of places when you raise under the gun. So you're going to get a 3 or 4 way pot. Flopping middle set is not that great of a result, and about half the time tens flops a set, it's going to be middle set, not top set. So that's pretty much a perfect example of an early position fold. I would definitely raise that hand from not off of the button, and possibly even from second position, depending on the players behind. All right, this is a fun hand down on the bottom right. A few different things to talk about. First of all, pre-flop, probably would not make this call if I didn't have the button. Definitely from out of position, but I've got a pair, I've got connected cards, I've got a chance to make Broadway, and I've got a chance to make the nut flush draw. Lots of combo flops. This is a very good flop. And one thing I want to focus on, in addition to the fact that I flop nut flush draw, is that I have 2 blockers to the nut straight, and I have that shot in order to tie that nut straight. I've got 3 outs to tie it. And that combination of things means that I think this is a profitable spot to bet and get it in. Not going to get check raised as often, and I've got plenty of outs. I've got backdoor outs too. If I happen to be up against a set, I've got a blocker. Obviously, I have to get there first, but I also have a blocker against him filling up, and I have a very small 1 or 2% bid equity against Jack 10 that comes from running up out. So it's a spot where the secondary parts of the hand were nice, and the 2 tens was a pretty big thing. Knowing that I can to 3 people, and the chance of any one of them having Jack 10 is substantially reduced, and I'm representing Jack 10 pretty well. A little bit of dead time here. I'll try to think of things to talk about during time when I'm not playing any hands, but I don't really have anything right now. All right, here's pocket kings with a suit, and the 10 is somewhat connected. The D starting hand, definitely something to isolate with in position. Would probably raise this from any position. Yeah, I would definitely raise this under the gun. I would call from the blinds. Top set of kings is much longer than I'm talking a bit about top sets, jacks and tens, or flopping middle set with that. Pocket kings is significantly stronger as a set draw, and I was playing the 6 the whole way. Now I have 3 of them. This is an interesting decision here. I get bet into and may be able to raise and just get it in, but I think you're often against ace-6. If you stack off, you could be against queens, you could be against queen-6. Now this is not a hand that I'm looking to fold at pretty much any point. Although I could fold the river if a guy pots it, depending on the guy. But in that case, I thought it was better to sort of keep worse hands around, and they didn't really have many outs against me. On the upper right here, I bet the flop just as a bluff and heads up, limp pot. Turn the gut shot, bet again. I figure that even if he has king jack, I've got if he has king jack, he'll raise and I'll fold. There's a lot of hands that he could call the flop with. He'd appeal with again and have outs, specifically a diamond draw. The main thing I was focusing on. So I bet again. He called, and then the river brings a blank. And I figured it was more likely I could get him to bluff with a missed flush draw than that I would get value from anything weaker. So I checked, and he checked behind with that missed flush draw and nothing else. So he wouldn't have called the bet. Right. Easy check fold there. I'm a fan of stabbing at pots randomly when very small pots, limped pot, blind versus blind or whatever. But that particular flop was Queen 9-8 double suited, or sorry, Queen 9-8 with a flush draw, and there's really no too much of his range, too much of a random range hits that flop, and he's got positions. There was no point. Here I 3-bet good aces. I'm double suited, and this is a perfect example. I flop a gut shot and 2 backdoor flush draws. That makes me comfortable stacking off even against the guy on the right here. As it turns out, I actually make that backdoor flush, and I check, and it turns out he had really bad hand. He was pretty well crushed. He had Queen Jack and Queen Jack 7-7, very few outs. Here on the upper left, I'm about to do a plug for Pokersavvy. I think they should pay me extra for that. Lower right, I don't think I raised this hand. I called with 9-8-8-7, which is a pretty good connected middle pair, and I've got position. After I see this flop, I'm done. Occasionally you'll be checked to in a 3 or 4 way pot and have a reason to bet with air. This is definitely not one of those spots. Actually, I think I do that once or twice later in the video, but this is not one of those spots. The flop hits too many parts of all of their ranges, and it's obviously completely unprofitable, so you just check behind and give up. There's really nothing I could end up doing that would, other than backdoing a straight flush or something, that would make me do anything with that hand. Here on the right, I'm going to raise this limper with ace king 10 deuce with a suit. Having 3 hearts is a bit of a negative, but I have 3 Broadway cards and a nut suit, and I've got position, which is extremely important. I wouldn't raise this hand under the gun. I probably would raise it in second position. I definitely would raise it from the cutoff and the button, whether or not there's a limper. Here I'm going to set a little bit less than the pot. This is something I tend to do in position, particularly in heads-up pots. In a multi-way pot, I'm more likely to have something, and so I'm gonna generally pot it. You saw that earlier with the nut flush and gut shot that I had on the same table. But if you have a big hand and the other guy has a big hand, you're going to get check raised and you're going to be able to get it in anyway. And because I'm going to want to be having other pots in position, I generally bet a little bit less than pot, 75 or 80% when I'm in position, and I'm more likely to bet full pot when I'm out of position. Here's another example. I've raised Queen 8-8 under the gun and got called by the small blind. Bet 3, I decide to 3 into 5 or 6, or 3 into 450 or something. Decided he could have a jack a decent amount of the time. When he check calls, he didn't lead out when the straight card came, and so I thought it would be a good spot to bet. I'm thinking for a bit here about whether or not to value bet. People will call with a jack here, and I things up, but I decided actually that there was a decent chance he could have kings or aces, and that he wouldn't necessarily pay off with a jack or with anything else. So I decided to go up and just show the hand down. There is training site Pokersavvy.com on the guy who was asking why I'm playing 25 cent, 50 cent, what I'm doing it for. Alright, that was pretty straightforward. I had a suited ace with a 3 straight and called, defend the big blind, flop nothing, and check folded. The flop was so dry, 10-3-3, that it's a flop that occasionally I would check raise bluff, but trying not to do anything too fancy in this video, so I just check folded. I wouldn't do that often either, just occasionally. Here's king 4-5 with just the spade. I think would not, I defended here, but I would not defend it against somebody who's positioned on me. Here, kind of scary flop, and he checks to me, so I'm going to take a stab at it. Once he check calls, I'm done with the hand, as you can see by the reload. Checks to me, and I picked up a pair, and I still have that shot. And get there. Checks, I'm never, I figure, never flush. Most times people will bet any flush there. So I bet enough to get a call from something. I didn't check what he has, but I think he most likely had a heavy high strip. Makes the most sense. Something like Queen Jack that River did, or I'm sorry, Queen 9. Here I'm going to raise in the upper left with Queen Jack 10 with a suit. Would not raise this any earlier in the cutoff, but I've got 3 connected cards and I do have a suit, which is it's a third nut suit, but it's a little bit of extra. It's possible I'd raise this under the gun +1. I probably wouldn't raise it under the gun. Really dry flop. I'm only going to get action from kings and flush draws, and they may, especially the guy out of position, may play the hand in such a way that I can profitably bluff him off it later. He may check call with a king and then check fold a club or something like that. So I'm going to take the c-bet stab 2/3 of the pot at it. He check raises, and obviously I fold. Alright, here's a good spot up in the upper right. Generally 3-betting out of position. I try not to do it as much as I did when I first started playing, partly because you're not putting the same kind of pressure on somebody when you 3-bet light as you do when hold'em. Oh, I thought that played out, never mind. But with a hand that's strong, suited broadways, king, queen 10, you actually kind of like, also because you're going to be flopping top 2 or like a pair and a gut shot, things like that. Top 2 and a gut shot, whatever. Hands that are strong but not as strong as sets and straights and flushes. It actually helps to have a lower stack to pot ratio, I think. You more comfortably bet and get it in because people are going to get it in later in a 3-bet pot. And I'm often going to be dominating stuff like, you know, king jack 10-7 or whatever other crap you raise the button with and calls because he's going to try to crack my aces. Generally, I would say that 3-betting lots out of position is not a good idea, and you pretty much should only do it for value. I don't do too much deception 3-betting, although I do some of it from out of position. I definitely 3-bet light more for button and the cutoff. I think that makes a lot of sense for obvious reasons. We'll probably get into it more in future videos. It's pretty easy standard open here. I've got a suit, nut suit, and connected cards. A few different ways I can flop well. I can flop the nuts, the nut flush obviously, or nut flush draw. Can flop a combo draw. You know, the 7 of spades is a very good card. And 4 of spades, whatever. Can flop even top 2 with ace 8. Occasionally will be a good thing to have. But it's definitely an easy hand to play in position. Here I raised, and I'm just betting queen jack 10-8 on the left side. Should probably do a better job of telling what which side which table I'm talking about. I'll try to remember to do that every time, although I guess you can pretty much figure it out. On the bottom left, I think I was just in the bind there, and I'm going to check fold. Just in terms of general, I guess I can make some general pre-flop strategy comments. A lot of people say that you can play a wide range of strategies. You can play a lot of hands. Playing Omaha, people play 40% of hands and profit. And I think generally speaking, it's true that the way games are playing, the way that Parliament Omahas play, it is a lot easier to make money playing very loose. A lot of the things that I've talked about already suggest playing relatively straightforward tag style. I think in this video I ended up running about 2014. Generally I run something closer to like 24-16, 24-17. I know a lot of good players that are playing 30% hands, and I think a lot of the reason they're able to do this is because they play very well from position. They do a job of exploiting weak players. They know when to bluff. And all these are poker skills that can help to enhance your win rate. But especially for a beginner, I think it's extremely important to focus on the fundamentals, and you will win money fairly effortlessly from low stakes players, especially if you're the one that's playing 20 to 25% of your hands, consistently playing pots in position, and if you're the one who gets it in on the good side of those redraws, who flops the nuts when someone else flops the second nuts, and you sort of naturally take advantage of them when they play too many hands. All right, over here, got ace, ace, king, 5 with a suit. It's pretty good. Aces, good enough to 3-bet, especially from position, especially if his larger raise size with the dead money in the pot. We've got only 2 times pot behind. This is one of those in-between flops where it doesn't hit enough of his range. He check raises all in. His range beats me. But it doesn't hit enough of his range, and I've already built pot. It's a pot that I should have built if I just had bare dry aces. I got too much, or didn't get enough money in to just have bare aces with nothing, but I re-raised good aces, and I flopped sort of something that wasn't connected to the side cards. But the pot was already big, and it's definitely correct to pot and take it down the times you missed, which will be a lot of the time. Occasionally get it in as a coin flip or so against the draw, and sometimes get it in pretty bad. But that's definitely a bet call spot. Here I raise these aces, and that flop is terrible. As soon as somebody bets, I'm folding. There's no reason to try to make any kind of play at the pot or anything like that. The naked ace of diamonds, I might do something. At some point later, I'll talk about naked ace play in another video. Right. To get back a little bit on what I was talking about pre-flop strategy, I do think that a wide range of styles can be profitable in the current games, anywhere from even playing a real nitty, just set mining, sorry, I wouldn't even say set mining, nut mining style, for like 15-10 or something like that, and playing the strongest hands and then trying to flop the nuts with them. Definitely profitable at full ring to play like that, and even at 6 max at the lower levels, all the way up to people who play well, good lag styles, playing 40-30 and so on, 3-betting light all the time from position. This can definitely be profitable. I think somewhere in the 25% of hands ranges where optimal style would converge if there weren't lots of bad players who could be outplayed post flop. The flip side is that in Omaha, if you play better opponents post flop, because the edges are smaller, because the hand values run closer together, you can probably get away with playing a larger percentage of hands, especially from the button and cutoff. That said, for the first couple of videos, I'm basically going to be talking about the style that I mostly play, which is something in the 25-15 range. All right, here's an ISO raise with. This is an interesting one on the bottom left. Remember this hand. I ISO raise with 7-6-6-4. I've got a suit. I've got some connectedness and a pair. That's most of the reason I'm playing this hand is because I have the button. I expect the blinds to fold most of the time. Sometimes one of them will call. Probably get a 3-way pot. I've got position, and I'm going to be able to win the pot a lot of the times that I flop bad, and probably play the hand pretty comfortably the times that flop good. They both check to me. Ace high flop. Fairly easy flop to see bet 3 ways. Bet about 2/3 of the pot. They really can't continue without an ace, and even a weak ace, if they check call, I may be able to barrel the turn. In that case, they both folded. Picked up a small pot. I guess point of emphasis about position. This is something that I think anybody who has a decent amount of no limit hold'em is coming over to PLO already understands, but it's obviously a really big advantage when you're deciding to bluff, flop, and or turn, to be able to see your opponent's check in front of you. It definitely weakens their range. They have to risk whiffing a check raise. They're more predictable when they check call on the flop. You can narrow the range down a bit more. if draw gets there, it's easier for you to represent it. If you somehow back into something, it's going to be easier to get paid. And so that combination of all those things means that in 3- and 4-way pots, I'm going to be c-betting from the button a lot more than I will be from any other position. Again, I don't. Obviously, that's nothing revolutionary, but it's something to always remember as you're playing game, but as you're playing Omaha, because you're going to be getting those 3- and 4-way pots a decent amount, and selectively picking those spots where it's just not likely that anybody who's checked you has something. Draw king high flop, where if you pot it, they're going to put you on a set of kings or something along those lines. You got to find those spots and take advantage of them. I think I'm gonna ISO raise here. Yeah, on the bottom right, raising with ace queen 4-3. A little odd way draw, a little bit of a wheel draw, and a flush draw. Again, it sucks that I've got 3 of the hearts, but I have position for the hand, and it's gonna be profitable. Here I flop trip jacks, and I think they just fold. Yeah, just fold. Double jacks on the button. I probably wouldn't defend this hand from the blinds. Definitely not heads up, and I wouldn't defend I wouldn't call with just dry jacks there, especially as the first one into the pot. I don't want to play that pot heads up. Play a pot heads up with jack 7 deuce or something like that, even if I have position. That flop. Oh, I just river the nuts on the top right. I'm going to get called. No reason to make a play at the pot on the left, even though I flopped a straight draw. The bottom right, I'm not sure how to rewind this. There was some interesting hand on the bottom right. Basically, that ace queen 4-3 flop is really dry. I check behind, considering a delayed c-bet. It's something that I do some percentage of the time. Had a couple backdoor draws, I think, backdoor heart and backdoor Broadway, and I actually flopped a pair of 3s, and I made trip 3s on the turn and bet when he checked to me, which was obviously the only thing I could do. Here I am going to raise these queens. This is really borderline. I would probably, well, got a straight draw, I've got a suit, get into a multi-way pot and flop top set. This is kind of the borderline where queens with these side cards is okay. Jacks not so much. Jack 7-5. I probably would just fold definitely under the gun, and I would raise from the button, and somewhere in between I would be the line, probably in between MP and cutoff. On the left, I called a raise with Jack 10-7. Pretty standard, especially from the button. This flop came, the guy bet, and I folded. There's really no opportunity to do anything else there. And a heads-up pot, it might be a pot where you could float, but I'm not going to try to get into that too much in this video anyway. It's supposed to be beginner basic video, and you completely missed the flop. Just fold in that spot, especially in a 4-way. 10-9-8-3, I think I had a suit with that. That's the kind of hand that a lot of people will defend incorrectly. It's a perfect example. You're going to be out of position whenever you flop something. If you flop is going to be mediocre a lot of time. You're going to check fold, and when you check call or check raise or whatever, the ranges you'll be facing that will put money in will have you beat. And so there's really no profitable way to play that hand from anywhere. 10-9-8-3 with one suit, but definitely no profitable way to play it from the small blind. Probably would only play it as a button raise. Definitely going to play this hand on the right. Don't remember exactly what happens with it, but lower right. Focus on that. He raises. His aces are good enough to re-raise, and I believe that's what I'm going to do. I do remember this hand. I play this hand kind of questionably. I believe the flop's going to come kind of dry, and I check behind. Yeah. What I decided here was that I could get check raised off the best hand decent amount of the time, and let's just watch it play out, and then I'll talk about what my thought process was. He bets the turn. I call. I check. He bets. He checks, and I check behind. He turns out to have a gut shot in 2 pair. on that particular flop, I was a lot of times I'll just bet fold, which is I just had aces. It was dry. We had like 4 or 5 times the pot behind. You get check raise and stick it in there, it would be pretty bad. I decided that some of the time he might check raise me with something like king, queen, jack, 10. I'd be folding the best hand, and I may be able to get one sort of value out of that hand later. I've got position in order to easier to do that, and I figured that not going to get bluffed too much on the run because the stakes that we're playing, it's a check on the flop doesn't necessarily going to induce a bluff that often. Here I flopped a got in the nut flush draw. Can really easily represent ace jack. They're going to fold unless they have something big. They do. To get back to that aces hand a bit, that's having re-raised and having about 4 or 5 times the pot behind and more or less missing the flop with aces is a fairly tricky spot to be in. Generally, I will continuation bet the vast majority of the time that it heads up and 3-bet, and I will even when I'm holding aces, what I just did there was something that I do less often than that I c-bet. But I wanted to use that as a chance to illustrate a potential time when you can check behind, sort of a value check, where depending on what cards come off on the turn, you can feel more comfortable about your hand versus the range that might have check raised you. If you would have check raised with a wrap and the wrap misses and he checks you again, you're going to be playing your hand for value instead of bet fold into a coin flip or as a slight, where you would be folding instead of getting it in a slight underdog. We probably have pot odds to do it. Obviously, you risk giving him a card that gives him 2 pair and or letting him bluff you off the best hand, or even turn and river barrel you off the best hand. So you got to balance those considerations in deciding whether or not to bet the flop. But I certainly think checking there is fine some percentage of the time, and generally calling 1-bet. Usually value betting, or betting the turn if check 2, calling the turn if bet 2 on a decent card, and then making a decision on the river based on what you've seen from the guy and what the river card is. I think I'm going to fold. Yeah, queen jack, queen 8 7 6 on the upper left. Another example of a hand that people who play too loose probably would call from the blinds. I think there was a suit in there too. Here I flop huge, and I think I'm going to try to milk this guy a bit. Get him to put it all in after he calls. Instead of pounding the turn, I'm going to bet a little over half pot and a little less than half stack. I don't think I was considering checking there, but maybe it was. He calls. River brings the flush. He could have been drawing 2, which would have been terrible. It's possible he had the other 6, but I would have expected him to raise at some point with it. Basically, my thought process there was that if he has the other 6, we're getting it in no matter what. He's going to raise at some point. So I might as well bet smallish in order to calls from, over pair, or he could have something like queen jack jack there, where he had a pair of jacks and then he turned to queen or king, whatever it was. So didn't quite get his whole stack, but I think that's fine bet sizing for the situation with that short of a stack. If he had a full stack, I'd be potting it and just hoping he has something big enough to go with. And this is, I think, the last hand I'm going to play. It's kind of interesting. Probably wouldn't even raise trip aces on the button, except on the button, but here I've got a suit and going to basically be able to play position most of the time. I can flop flush draw and flush, whatever. And I have flopped the nut flush draw, and on this particular board, when he check raises here, which he's about to do, he basically can have a set of tens, a wrap that I have blocked, or a worse draw. He could have something like end with a worse spade draw. And against that range, I'm in decent shape. Against the set, I'm 30%, something like that. Against the tens, I'm a pretty significant favorite. It's a particular hand that he had. It's about 55-45, I think, maybe close to 60-40. His favorite. He's the favorite. In general, I'm doing okay against that range. On a more high or more connected board, like a Jack 10 6 or something like that, I may not be as comfortable bet calling because I'm betting and getting it in. Kind of a weird spot to get stuck in with trip aces, but that was a huge flop for that for the ace 7. In fact that I had the third ace in my hand didn't really mean that much at that point. Generally speaking, I would say never play trips, though. Trip aces with a suit is probably the only example of something I would ever play. Occasionally, if you can find a way to stick it all in pre-flop, but most of the time won't be able to do that. And otherwise, anything trip kings or trip queens or whatever is always a fold 100% of the time. I think this is about going to wrap it up. 5 seconds left. Thanks for watching the first video. There will be 2 more videos in this series. The second one will be at 1-2. The third one will be at 2-4. In general, my goals with this series are twofold. I want to talk about how to deal with high levels of aggression as you move up in stakes, and I also want to just move from some beginning theory concepts to intermediate theory concepts. So the 1-2 video's main focus will be on 3-bet pots. I think that's about the right place for it at that stakes. And we'll talk about how to play with aces and against aces, and also how to 3-bet a balanced range, and sort of the different types of opponents that you'll face in terms of what they do in 3-bet pots and what their 3-betting range is. There are some people who 3-bet only aces, and playing against them is relatively straightforward. Also want to try to get into the different kinds of wraps and some of the basic equity math, such as what's the equity that a set has against the flush draw and wrap on the flop, and something like that. Things like that. In the final video, I'm going to talk about some slightly more advanced concepts, a bit about board texture, talk about the naked ace play, talk about spots where you can float and bluff raise, along with just taking whatever the hands that are played in the video gives me. So that's the plan, and hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll come back for the next 2. That's it for now.